In the year 1469, a teenage girl stood at the edge of a kingdom that was falling apart. Around her, civil war had torn the Iberian Peninsula into a patchwork of feuding nobles, foreign claimants, and collapsing institutions. Her own brother had just died under circumstances that to this day remain deeply suspicious. Her right to the throne was being contested by nearly every powerful man in the room. She was 17 years old, virtually penniless, and in the eyes of the world, utterly powerless. And yet, within 30 years, this same woman would unite a fractured land, fund the voyage that stumbled onto an entirely new continent, complete the longest religious reconquest in history, and build the foundations of the first global empire the world had ever seen. Her name was Isabella, and without her, there would be no Spain. What makes Isabella of Castile one of the most consequential figures in all of human history is not just what she accomplished, it is how she accomplished it. She did it in a world designed entirely to exclude her. She did it without armies loyal to her name, without a treasury, and without the support of the men who were supposed to protect her. She outmaneuvered kings, outthought generals, and outlasted enemies who were far better resourced than she ever was. To understand how, you have to go back to where it all began and understand just how precarious her position truly was from the very first breath she drew. Isabella was born on April 22, 1451, in Madrigal de las Altas Torres, a small Castilian town whose very name, Tower of the High Towers, speaks to the fortified, defensive nature of medieval Iberian life. Her father, King John II of Castile, was not a strong ruler. He was a man dominated by favorites, paralyzed by court intrigue, and widely regarded as one of the weakest monarchs Castile had ever endured. When he died in 1454, Isabella was just 3 years old. Her older half-brother Alfonso became heir, and Isabella and her younger brother, also named Alfonso, were taken to live at court under the supervision of their mother, Isabella of Portugal, who was slowly losing her grip on sanity under the pressures of court life. Court was not a nurturing place for the young princess. She watched as the new king, her half-brother Henry IV, presided over a Castile descending into disorder. Henry was a profoundly troubled man, mocked by his own nobles with the cruel nickname El Impotente, the impotent, because his marriage had produced no children for years. When his queen finally delivered a daughter, Juana, in 1462, the whispers that spread through every court in Europe were devastating. The child, it was said, was not Henry's at all. The nobles called the girl La Beltraneja, implying she was the daughter of Beltran de la Cueva, the king's rumored favorite. Whether this was true or merely political weaponry wielded by Henry's enemies, no one can say with certainty. But the damage was done. Henry's authority evaporated almost overnight. In 1465, a group of Castilian nobles did something almost unthinkable. They staged a ceremony now known as the Farce of Avila, in which they literally deposed a life-size effigy of King Henry from a throne, knocked the crown from its head, and proclaimed Isabella's younger brother Alfonso as the rightful king of Castile. Spain was now a kingdom at war with itself. Isabella, barely 14, was watching and learning. She was learning what happened to rulers who lost the trust of their nobility. She was learning that power was not simply inherited. It had to be claimed, defended, and continuously earned. And she was beginning to understand that she herself was a player in this deadly game, whether she wished to be or not. The civil war between Henry and the noble faction backing Alfonso lasted 3 brutal years. Then in 1468, Alfonso died. He was 14 years old. The official cause was plague, but rumors of poison swirled immediately. The rebel nobles, desperate for a figurehead, turned to Isabella. They offered to crown her queen on the spot. What she did next revealed everything about the kind of leader she would become. She refused. She refused not out of cowardice, but out of something rarer and more powerful, strategic wisdom. To accept a crown offered by rebels would delegitimize her reign from its very first moment. Instead, she negotiated directly with her half-brother Henry, and the result was the Treaty of Toros de Guisando, signed in September 1468. Under this agreement, Henry recognized Isabella as his heir to the throne of Castile. She had just secured the succession, not through force, but through political brilliance. But the treaty came with a string attached that Henry expected to control her through entirely. He reserved the right to approve her marriage. In the medieval world, a woman's husband was her political destiny. Whoever married Isabella would rule Castile in all but name. Henry had his own candidate, Afonso V of Portugal, an older widower who would absorb Castile into Portugal and eliminate Isabella as a political independent entirely. Isabella had different ideas. She had been corresponding secretly with emissaries from the neighboring kingdom of Aragon, and she had her eye on someone very specific, a young man her own age, the heir to the Aragonese throne, a prince who had already proven himself in battle despite being barely 17. His name was Ferdinand. The obstacles to this marriage were extraordinary. Ferdinand was from a rival kingdom. Henry had explicitly forbidden the match. The Pope's blessing had not been secured. Ferdinand had no money for the journey and no safe passage. Agents of Henry IV were watching Isabella's every move. And yet, in October 1469, Ferdinand arrived in Valladolid disguised as a mule driver's assistant, traveling with a handful of companions through hostile territory to reach the woman he had never met. When they finally stood face to face, the chemistry was immediate. By all contemporary accounts, they genuinely liked each other from the very first meeting. 5 days later, on October 19, 1469, they were married in a small ceremony with a papal dispensation that was, technically speaking, forged. They were betting everything on being able to secure the real thing later. Henry IV was furious. He declared Isabella's claim to the throne forfeit and began pushing the cause of Juana la Beltraneja once more. For the next 5 years, Isabella and Ferdinand navigated a political minefield, managing Castilian nobles, managing each other's egos and ambitions, managing the very real threat of military force from their opponents. What is remarkable about their partnership is how genuinely equal it was, at least by the standards of the era. They adopted a joint coat of arms, governed jointly, issued proclamations together. The motto they chose, Tanto Monta, Monta Tanto, Isabel como Fernando, translated to something close to, they amount to the same, Isabella as Ferdinand. It was a statement of unprecedented symmetry. Henry IV died in December 1474, and Isabella did not hesitate for a single day. She moved immediately, had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile in Segovia, and began the work of consolidating power before anyone could organize against her. The war for the throne that followed pitted her against Portugal, whose King Afonso V had married Juana la Beltraneja and invaded Castile to press her claim. What happened next was one of Isabella's finest hours, not because she led armies herself, but because she directed the entire campaign with extraordinary logistical and political intelligence. She raised funds, recruited soldiers, maintained alliances, and kept the fractious Castilian nobility unified behind a single cause. At the Battle of Toro in 1476, Ferdinand led her forces to a decisive victory. The war was over. Isabella was queen beyond all challenge, but winning the crown was merely the beginning. The Castile Isabella had inherited was broken. The nobility had grown so powerful during decades of civil war that they essentially operated as independent warlords. Crime was rampant. The roads were controlled by bandits. The treasury was empty. Isabella later said she could not even afford to repair the roof of her palace when it rained. To fix this, she did something radical. She empowered a civic organization called the Hermandad, essentially a national police force funded by the towns rather than the nobles, and sent them to restore order across the kingdom. Within a few years, Castile's roads were safer than they had been in living memory. It was an exercise in state building that would be studied by political theorists for centuries. Then came the decision that would cast the longest shadow over Isabella's legacy, and that still sparks fierce debate more than 5 centuries after her death. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand requested and received a papal bull authorizing the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was officially aimed at rooting out false conversion, at identifying Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, known as conversos and moriscos, who were suspected of secretly practicing their original faiths. What followed was a period of religious persecution that included torture, public burnings, and the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, culminating in 1492 with the Alhambra Decree, which gave the Jews of Spain 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the country entirely. Somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people went into exile. An unknown number more converted under duress. To understand Isabella without grappling with the Inquisition is to understand only half of her. She was a woman of genuine, fervent, even consuming religious faith. She believed with her whole heart that religious unity was essential to the stability and survival of her kingdom. She saw the Inquisition not as cruelty but as medicine, brutal perhaps, but necessary to the body politic she was trying to heal. This is not a defense of what was done. The suffering was real, the injustice profound, and the loss to Spanish culture incalculable. But it is impossible to understand Isabella's world without understanding that for her, faith was not a private matter. It was the very foundation of everything. Her title, granted by Pope Alexander VI, was Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. It was the title she treasured most. And then came 1492. The year that changed the shape of the world forever. Not once, but 3 separate times, in 3 separate events that would each have been enough to define an entire era on their own. In January of that year, Isabella and Ferdinand rode into Granada, the last Moorish kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, and accepted its surrender. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain that had begun nearly 8 centuries earlier, was complete. It was the fulfillment of a dream that had consumed the Iberian kingdoms for generations. Isabella wept when the banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the Alhambra. The last Moorish king, Boabdil, looked back at the city as he rode into exile. The spot where he allegedly paused to grieve is still called, in Spanish, the last sigh of the Moor. Just months later came the second world-changing event of that year, the Alhambra decree expelling the Jews. And then in August 1492, 3 ships sailed from the port of Palos de la Frontera on a voyage authorized, funded, and championed by Queen Isabella herself. The idea had been rejected by Portugal. It had been rejected by multiple committees of Spanish scholars. Ferdinand had been skeptical. Isabella had hesitated too, for years. But something about Christopher Columbus's conviction had gotten under her skin. When her treasurer finally calculated that the potential cost of the voyage was actually quite modest, equivalent to the jewels she had pledged, Isabella made the decision. Columbus would sail, and 10 weeks later, he made landfall on an island in the Caribbean. The consequences of that October morning in 1492 are beyond any single documentary's power to fully capture. Within a generation, the encounter between Europe and the Americas would reshape the global economy, spark the largest demographic catastrophe in human history with the collapse of indigenous populations, and create the first truly global trade networks. Silver from the Americas would flood Europe and destabilize its economies. Foods from the New World, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, would transform the diets of billions of people across the planet. The world that exists today was fundamentally shaped by the voyage Isabella funded. Whether that legacy is a cause for celebration or mourning depends entirely on whose story you are telling. In the years that followed, Isabella continued to govern with extraordinary energy. She reformed the Castilian legal system, creating a body of laws that replaced the feudal patchwork with a coherent national code. She reformed the church, insisting on educated, moral clergy at a time when corruption was endemic. She built universities. She patronized the arts. She and Ferdinand negotiated marriages for their children across the royal houses of Europe. Their daughter Catherine would eventually become Queen of England and the first wife of Henry VIII, sparking a chain of events that would lead directly to the English Reformation. The reach of Isabella's decisions extended across the whole of the Western world. But the private cost of that reach was devastating. Isabella outlived 3 of her 5 children. Her son Juan, the heir to everything she had built, died suddenly at 19, just months after his marriage. Her daughter Isabella, Queen of Portugal, died in childbirth. Her grandson Miguel, who would have united Spain and Portugal, died as a toddler. And her most beloved surviving child, Juana, who would inherit Castile, began showing signs of severe psychological disturbance following the death of her own husband, Philip the Handsome. Juana would eventually be confined as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, though whether she was truly mad or simply a political inconvenience remains one of history's most debated questions. Isabella's health deteriorated rapidly in her final years. She suffered from what contemporaries described as a wasting fever, likely some form of serious infection or cancer. She continued to work as long as she was physically able, receiving ambassadors and signing documents even from her sickbed. In her final months, she dictated one of the most remarkable documents of the medieval era, her last will and testament. In it, she expressed genuine remorse for the suffering of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, instructing her heirs that they must be treated with justice and humanity. It was a recognition, too late and ultimately too little heeded, that something had gone terribly wrong in the encounter between the old world and the new. She died on November 26, 1504, at the castle of La Mota in Medina del Campo. She was 53 years old. Ferdinand, who had campaigned alongside her and argued with her and loved her and infuriated her for 35 years, was at her bedside. He wept openly, something that men of his position rarely did and rarely admitted to. The news of her death traveled across Europe within weeks, and every court on the continent understood immediately that something irreplaceable had passed from the world. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian said of her, "She is dead, she who was worth the whole world." What is the legacy of Isabella of Castile? It is immense, and it is complicated, and it defies any simple verdict. She created Spain not as a single administrative entity, since Castile and Aragon would remain formally separate kingdoms for another 2 centuries, but as a unified political reality, a common project, a shared identity that had not existed before her. She built the institutional foundations, the legal system, the Reformed Church, the professional army, the administrative bureaucracy on which the Spanish Empire would stand. That empire, for all its brutality and exploitation, was also the vehicle through which European civilization, language, religion, and culture spread to half the globe. She funded the encounter between 2 worlds that had been separated for 10,000 years, and in doing so, she set in motion forces that neither she nor anyone else could have possibly predicted or controlled. The suffering that followed, and there was immense, unimaginable suffering, cannot be laid entirely at her feet, but neither can it be separated entirely from decisions she made. She was not a saint. She was not a monster. She was something far more interesting and far more human, a woman of extraordinary capability and genuine faith, operating at the very edge of what was possible in her time, making choices that echoed across centuries. 500 years after her death, the country she built remains. The language she spoke is today the native tongue of nearly 500 million people. The legal traditions she codified are embedded in the law of a dozen nations. The cathedral she commissioned in Granada, built beside the Alhambra palace she conquered, still stands. And inside it, in a small stone tomb of almost startling modesty, lie the remains of Isabella and Ferdinand, the 2 people who, between them, invented the modern world. She asked to be buried without pomp, without excess, without the elaborate monuments that lesser rulers demand. Even in death, she was making a statement. The work was what mattered. The kingdom was what endured. History does not often give us figures whose decisions so profoundly shape the world we live in today. Isabella of Castile is one of the vanishingly rare exceptions, a person whose choices, made in a small stone room in the heart of medieval Iberia, are still shaping the lives of billions of people more than 5 centuries later. You cannot understand the Americas without her. You cannot understand the modern Catholic Church without her. You cannot understand Spain without her. She arrived into a world that offered her nothing and left behind a world that was, for better and for worse, fundamentally different from the one she had found. That is what it means to create a nation. That is what it means to change history. And that is why when we ask who built the foundation of the modern Western world, the answer, more often than most of us realize, begins with the name of a 17-year-old girl who refused to be erased.